Lecture 5.3, The Age of Napoleon. Okay, so who was Napoleon Bonaparte? So he lived from 1769 to 1821, and he was born of Italian descent on the French island of Corsica. He was a military genius, and he was an avid child of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And what he would do was he would eventually inspire this divided nation, like during that Directory period following the French Revolution, and he would unify it, and he unified them, but that was at the price of individual liberty. Okay, so starting with this first era of time being this Consulate period, what happened here was on December 25th, 1799, the Constitution gave supreme power to Napoleon, and he created this first consul where he was able to behave as this absolute ruler over France. And what he did was he created a lot of reforms, including, as one of them being the Napoleonic Code, that provided the first clear and complete codification of French law. So it's it's also known as his lasting legacy of his rule, and many achievements that were made during the French Revolution were made permanent, such as equality before the law, freedom of religion, property rights, abolition of serfdom, and it denied women equal status to men, although women did gain inheritance rights. The second reform here were careers open to talent, and theoretically, citizens were able to rise in government service purely according to their talents and their abilities. But in practice, however, nobility was rewarded, and money was granted more services, so it didn't work out as planned. Moving on to these more religious reforms, like the Concordat of 1801 with the Roman Catholic Church. So here, Napoleon's motives were to make peace with the church, to help weaken its link to the monarchists who sought restoration with the Bourbons. And here they did a bunch of reforms. They extended legal toleration to Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and atheists, so they all received the same civil rights. The Pope renounced claims to church property that had been seized during the Revolution, and just a lot more. Regarding financial unity, the Bank of France in 1800 was created, and it served the interests of the states and the financial oligarchy. But what it did too was it revived version of one of the banks of the old regime, and in doing so, it had this government balanced national budget and established a currency and a public credit. Okay, so educational reforms. Educational reforms are based on a system of public education under state control. So there were standards and they were available to the masses, and Napoleon here, he sought to increase the size of the middle class, and education was important in determining social standings. One of his big reforms too were the creation of this police state. So he had this spy system that kept thousands of citizens under surveillance, and they would ruthlessly put down opposition to anyone that tried to overtake his regime. And notoriously, in 1804, that he arrested and executed the Bourbon, the Duke of Enghien, who had allegedly took a plot against Napoleon. So now regarding some of the drawbacks of his reforms, those included the severe inequality for women, the workers were not allowed to form unions, just that repressed liberty of that whole police state, and it also there was nepotism too, where he placed relatives on the throne, even though it was supposed to be talent based, but there was that nepotism there. Okay, so moving on to the Empire period from 1804 to 1814. In this period consisted a lot of wars. That's just the major theme. So on December 2nd, 1804, this started when Napoleon crowned himself hereditary Emperor of France in Notre Dame Cathedral. And here he began this grand empire that was engaged in constant warfare, and some of his allies during this included Austria, Prussia, and Russia, um, and these were in this grand empire. So now moving on to some of the wars. Let's start with the first one being the War of the Third Coalition, which is from 1805 to 1807. And this is when Napoleon made preparations to invade Britain. Um, and here in 1805, Austria did sign an alliance with Britain. And at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, French and Spanish fleets were destroyed by the British Navy under the command of Lord Horatio Nelson off the Spanish coast. And this event here established the supremacy of the British Navy for over a century. And here, a French invasion of Britain was no longer feasible, and that opportunity for Napoleon was kind of diminished. So, although this wasn't a war, something that happened soon afterwards were the reorganization of Germany. Oh, actually, before I go on to this, this war ended with the Treaty of Tilsit, and it was in June of 1807. And here, Napoleon was successful, and this treaty kind of represents the height of Napoleon's success. So the provisions were Prussia lost half its population to France. Russia accepted Napoleon's reorganization in Western and Central Europe, and they also accepted Napoleon's continental system, which I'll explain more about in a bit. Okay, so the reorganization of Germany. So, after defeating two of the most powerful and influential German states, Austria and Prussia, Napoleon reorganized the German army. So he had consolidated many of the nearly 300 independent political entities within Germany and created this Confederation of the Rhine, where 15 German states were unified minus Austria, Prussia, and Saxony. And Napoleon named himself this protector of the Confederation. And here also, the Holy Roman Empire was abolished. So now moving on to this continental system. So Napoleon decided to wage this economic warfare on Britain after his loss at the Battle of Trafalgar. So that battle led him to create the system. And it was almost like his first major mistake, because it was supposed to be a closed trade system that created an embargo and blockades on Great Britain and their goods with continental Europe, and it was supposed to make Europe stronger and British losing trade, but this was ultimately a major failure, and it caused this widespread antagonism to Napoleon's rule in Europe. Um, so so that was like his first major downfall. The war after this was the Peninsulan War from 1808 to 1814, and this is when the first great revolt against Napoleon's power occurred in Spain. So this was what led to his major, didn't lead to his downfall, but was part of his downfall. And here the Spanish people waged a costly guerrilla war, and that's essentially what happened. So this picture here is a picture of the continental system and how it went about. And then if we move on to the next slide, you see more of this, the reorganization of Germany and that Confederation of the Rhine. Alright, so let's get into some more wars. Starting with the War of the Fourth Coalition. This is a big one. It lasted from 1813 to 1814, and there was a lot of major events pertaining to this war. So, the Battle of Le Pez, I don't know how to say that. It also known as the Battle of Nations. Here, in October of 1813, Napoleon was finally defeated. He lost 500,000 of his 600,000 troops to that great army, and here Napoleon was abdicated as emperor on April 4th, 1814, and the Bourbons were restored to the throne in France. So, the Restoration actually did maintain most of Napoleon's reforms, such as the Code Napoleon and the Concordat with the Pope, and also his abolition of feudalism. So the Treaty of Paris, or the first Treaty of Paris, was in 1814, and here France surrendered all its territory since that it gained since the French Revolution begun in 1792. So that was like the major thing that happened during this. And Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba. So then the Quadruple Alliance, which was the alliance that defeated Napoleon, was agreed to meet in Vienna to arrange this peace settlement, which leads to the Congress of Vienna. The representations of the major European powers were there, including France, and they met to redraw territorial lines and try to restore the social and political order in this regime. So the big four were Austria, England, Prussia, and Russia that were there. And Austria was represented by Clemens von Metternich. England was represented by Lord Castlereagh, and then Tsar Alexander I represented Russia. Here, the principles of settlement, legitimacy, compensation, and the balance of power were established. And so this leads to the 100 Days. So the 100 Days were in 1815. It lasted from March 20th to June 22nd. And here, Napoleon capitalized on Vienna and escaped from Elba, and he went to France. So Napoleon landed in France, and he marched with this large scale of popular support into Paris, where he seized power from the Bourbon King Louis, and who Louis did flee to Paris. And he raised his army. He defeated a Prussian army, but at the Battle of Waterloo, here was the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars, and it ended this 100 Days, this resurgence. So here, Napoleon was defeated in Waterloo, Belgium, by England's army led by the Duke of Wellington and Prussian forces. And this just overall led to the Second Treaty of Paris, where now the first one had been quite lenient, but now that Quadruple Alliance dealt harshly with France and subsequent negotiations. Okay, so to conclude this video, let's go into a short overview of Napoleon's legacy, so to say. So his positive achievements. Revolutionary institutions were established through his reforms. The French government was centralized, and he made this lasting settlement with the church. His impact on other countries. Well, serfdom was abolished in most of Germany by 1807, and Germany was reorganized and unified. Now moving on to liabilities. Here he repressed individual liberty, he subverted republicanism, he oppressed and conquered peoples throughout Europe, and caused this terrific suffering as a result of all his wars. So, thank you so much. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe.